Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. There's a widespread misconception that with enough data, we can learn the truth. In this chapter, we have been arguing that causal paths are not there in the data, and they must be learned by examining qualitative and hidden features of the real world. For example, intentions of the decision-making agents. In this final segment of this chapter, we will reinforce this lesson and show how failure to understand causality has led to fundamental methodological problems in econometrics. Even though it's almost obvious, it is not understood by statisticians that data make sense only in the context of a narrative. Numbers by themselves do not talk. The same numbers lend themselves to different, even opposite narratives. For example, 6 losses by Bruce, the King of Scots, can be woven into a narrative of extra effort and courage is required for victory, or into a narrative of our fate is failure. The facts remain the same, but the narrative is dramatically different. The same is true in statistics. Good narratives conform to ground realities, but they go beyond the observable data. A fundamental methodological understanding which is at the base of modern statistics is the idea that numbers by themselves are enough. In fact, the data are never enough. It is always a narrative which makes the data speak. Conventional statistics brainwashes us into ignoring the narrative. Regressions results are presented by the thousands in published articles, but regressions provide results only under assumptions which are never fully discussed and clarified to students. And all of statistics operates in this way. As a reminder, we discussed some examples which have been discussed in previous segments of this lecture. When high blood pressure occurs as a mediator on the path from treatment to cure, that leads to entirely different analysis. And when high blood pressure is a confounder for the treatment, that leads to an entirely different analysis. And the data cannot give us any clues as to whether or not this is true. Which of these two causal pathways is true requires investigating real-world structures. Similarly, if we want to analyze discrimination at Berkeley, we must talk to the members of the admissions committee about what they do. It is not enough to analyze the data. Without having such a conversation, we would not even know which data should be analyzed. Given that this is so obvious that numbers cannot be analyzed without the real-world context, the real puzzle is why is the opposite idea so dominant and so pervasive in conventional analysis? There is a long and complex explanation, which we provide a few clues here, but more extensive discussions are available elsewhere. Basically, rejection of Christianity in Europe led to the trauma of loss of faith. And empiricism was the response, that we will only trust what we can believe and what we can touch and see, and we reject the evidence of the heart because the heart deceived us into believing in God. So this led to a beliefs in observables and the external world, and rejection of the knowledge of our internal and spiritual world. The observables can be measured, and that led to Lord Kelvin's blunder that we have knowledge of something only when we can measure it. And this led to increasingly meaningless measurements which are completely missing the mark in areas like IQ and trust and confidence and faith. All of these things, these are qualitative characteristics of the heart, and they cannot be measured by numbers. But the opposite is widely believed. One of the keys to understanding causality is exogeneity, something which happens without a previous cause, like our free decision to take an action, which although is dependent on our reasoning and our thoughts about the future, it doesn't depend directly on what happened in the past. So if something is chosen freely and then something else happens as a result, then we have a very strong clue that it happens as a result of our actions. The philosophers ask, how can we be sure? And the answer is we cannot be sure. And basically all of human knowledge is imperfect and uncertain, But unfortunately, Western philosophers search for certainty, and because they search for certainty, they reject this intuition and hunches and imperfect knowledge as part of knowledge. The other source of exogeneity is random events, which lead to something which is not connected directly with the past. But again, the widespread conception that was created by Newton's laws is that we live in a deterministic universe, and the philosophers still have not gone over that. As a result, the idea of a randomness as a source of exogeneity is missing from standard treatments. This philosophical failure to understand exogeneity has had serious consequences in terms of understanding the real world. We will present two examples. One is the case of the supply side economics versus the demand side economics. According to supply side, capital and labor, the input factors are exogenous. This means that we start here. These two are determined, and then production is determined because they are related by a production function. Once the production is determined, then it is distributed into consumption and investment. So if the government invests, this can have no beneficial effect on production. Similarly, if the consumers demand more, again, this will have no effect because the production has already been made. In exact opposition to this, the demand side says that it is the demand of the consumers and investors which is the exogenous variable. So once the demand is made known to the producers, then they hire the factors of production, capital and labor, enough to supply for the demand. In that case, the demand determines the production, and there is no crowding out, and so basically to grow the economy, to pull it out of recession, we must work on changing the demand. This is entirely different strategy for growth, and it is impossible to resolve this problem of which of these is the true theory by using data, because they concern causal sequences. We must study the real world to learn which of the factors is exogenously determined. Causal path diagrams give us a very important tool for clear thinking about causality. So here's a sketch of the supply side, where the capital and the labor are the exogenous factors. They determine output, and that determines the what is consumed, what is invested. And this is why in the supply side economics, the Walras law that supply generates demand is of central importance. Once the output is determined, then it will be sold, it will to whoever demands it, and it is the supply which actually determines the demand. On the opposite side, the Keynesian theory starts with expectations. Both investor expectations determine how much they invest today for production tomorrow, and consumers make plans to consume, which are signaled to the producers. Producers look at what they see and they make production decisions. They hire capital and labor, which determines output, and that finally determines the actual levels of investment and consumption. But here the driver of the whole process is the expectations, and because of this different exogeneity, the tools for manipulating the system are entirely different between supply side and demand side. A second example of failure to understand exogeneity is the standard supply and demand theory, which is one of the central models of economic theory. The supply and demand theory determines the equilibrium price. So price is an endogenous variable in this theory because it is determined by the supply curve and the demand curve, the intersection of the two. But when you chalk out the demand curve, you ask the consumer, take the price as exogenous and ask how much would you demand if the price is the value P star. Now this question itself is in conflict with the model, because the model says that the price is endogenous, but the demand curve is asking consumers to take it as exogenous. And similarly, the supply curve asks the producers how much they would produce if the price was some exogenous value P star. So there is a conflict between what the model says about the price and the questions you asked to create the model of the demand and the supply curve. If the price is endogenous, then these questions do not make sense. The equilibrium price is determined by the supply and the demand, and so it cannot be varied, it cannot be changed. The thought experiment required to construct supply and demand cannot be maintained. When you change the price in an economic system, everything changes. So you can't ask about the isolated effect of a single price change on a demand or a supply. All this confusion is caused by not keeping clear what is exogenous and what is endogenous. How can we decide which of the two models, the supply side or the demand side vision of economics, is true? As we've said, it can't be done by looking at the data. This is about the narratives which explain the data. And the narratives require thinking about how investors make investment decisions, how consumers make consumption plans, how producers make production decisions, and how price setters make pricing decisions. And there is a book by Alan Blinder which asks these questions and comes to conclusions which are rather different from what is found in standard economic textbooks, because economic textbooks do not ask these questions. They make assumptions on the basis of faulty theory about how these decisions are made, and they never cross-check them with the data. As another example of failure to understand the causal pathways, we have money and inflation. The standard approach and the standard theory was that increase in money supply leads to inflation, and for a long time it was fashionable to run regressions of money on various determinants, regressions of inflation on various aspects of money. But all such approaches eventually failed to find a stable function, and this effort was quietly abandoned because they were looking for correlational pathways, and none of these proved stable. They were not looking at causal pathways, and the same fate was suffered by macroeconomic models, which were once dominant tool for modeling the economy. There was a widespread forecast failure in the 1970s of such models, and this eventually led to abandonment of this methodology. Why did this happen? Well, the basic cause was failure to understand causality, as we will discuss in greater detail. So it all started with the Cowles Commission approach to causality. According to the Cowles Commission, the theory, economic theory, gives us the causal pathways, and that gives us both the exogenous variables and the structure of the economy. And this roughly corresponds to the causal path diagram. All the information in causal path diagrams is incorporated into the Cowles Commission approach with simultaneous equations, exogenous variables, and structural equation. This approach led to massive predictive failure of macro models after the Yom Kippur War, which led to oil embargo and stagflation in the US economy. New types of economic structures came into existence. Basically, the causal chains do not break under shocks, but the correlations do break down, and there was a shock to the economy, and there was not, the models didn't differentiate sufficiently between causal relations and correlations. As a result of this failure, there were three approaches that were developed. One was by Sims, and he said that let's abandon the idea of exogeneity and structure, forget all about causes, and just go to a pure number crunching approach, and that's the VAR models. So basically the idea is to study the correlations only, and the idea is that correlations by themselves will be sufficient for us. The Lucas critique went in the opposite direction. Instead of throwing away the causes, we need to go deeper into the causal structure, but the deeper structure involved axiomatic theory based on capitalist ideology, and the causes and the structure were derived from pure theory, but this theory was false. And the third approach that was developed was known as the Henry critique, or the London School of Economics method. And basically they said we need to continue to use correlations, but we should look for stable correlations which do better under change of other relationships. So this is a more sophisticated approach, but the question is, can stable correlations be found without studying causation? And the answer is no. What is the right approach to model failure or forecast failure? We must search for causal chains. But how can we do that? Well, basically we start with some baseline, like the Cauls Commission. We start with a theory which tells us what the causal chains are, what the exogenous variables are, and what the structure of the model is, which pathways lead to which variables. This should be based both on theory and on empirical observations of the world. Then we can, once you have specified a causal pathway, you can test the links. And testing can be done in a large number of different ways. Once you specify a causal structure for the real world, this has a lot of different implications, and many of these can be tested in many ways different from just sheer data analysis. You can ask questions to people about how they behave, and you can ask questions to decision makers about how they make decisions. The deeper problem is discovery of causal structures, and this requires investigation which goes beyond the data, and there's a widespread misconception that data by itself is enough and we just need lots and lots of it, the big data illusion. So the key step to discovery of causal structure is to look for short and strong direct causal paths. For example, it's a widely accepted theory that if we pump money into the economy, this will lead to inflation. But if you want to discover causes, then you ask, how will it lead to inflation? So you study carefully in detail what happens when money is created. Well, one of the ways to create money is to lower the discount rate. When the central bank lowers the discount rate, the banks will increase borrowing because the price of borrowing has gone down. Overnight loans from the central bank and also in the interbank market will rise. So we should study this first round impact. What happens immediately as a response? How strong is this response? How stable is it? How it is affected by other environmental and structural variables? This is the short and strong direct causal path. Then we can go to second round impact. Once the banks have this extra money, what do they use the money for? Why do they borrow money? What are their purposes? What are the goals of the banks? And then when they lend them this money, that creates the third round impact. What do the lenders do with the money? Why do they borrow money, etc.? All of these things are needed to study the causal impacts, the causal chain which comes into action when you create more money. Without studying this causal chain, you cannot understand the causal path diagram. So one way to think about causal mechanism is as a search for mediators. If we know that X causes Y, the question becomes, how does X cause Y? What are the channels used to create this effect? So we look for mediators M such that X affects M and then M affects Y. We also need to look at the intentions. Who is doing what? Why did X change? Who was trying to change X, and what were the goals of the policymakers in changing X? Furthermore, we also need to look at the models that the policymakers have. The models have some causal mechanism in their mind which induces them to take the action. So we not only need to look at the real causal pathways in the economy, we need to look at the imagined or modeled causal pathways in the minds of the decision makers. And this is the difficult meta-analysis that is involved in discovery of causal structures. So causal path diagrams are one of the important tools in studying causality, and there are many advanced concepts in path diagrams which we have not covered. We have only given a simple exposition of basic concepts. Once you put down a causal path diagram, then this clarifies the nature of subsequent data analysis. But this analysis cannot be reduced to regression models or any of the standard statistical and econometric methods. Because these methods impose extraneous assumptions, which are not reducible to data, and because this is a hypothesized causal path diagram, it may not be valid. So we need to always consider this as a hypothesis about reality which may or may not be true. So one part, discovery of the causal path, is not easy. The other part, once you have a causal pathway, how do you do a data analysis? This part can be routinized and is subject to a thorough study, which we will do in a later course. So to conclude with, we have explained why big data and machine learning cannot go about learning the qualitative structures of the real world. Robert Schiller, in a recent book called Narrative Economics, has described how dinners at conversation tables shaped the expectations and the models of the public about how the economy is running, and this was a major contributor to the collapse of the stock market, which led to the Great Depression. Viral narratives have great impact on expectations of people, and this is in line with Keynesian economics, that people's expectations matter. And furthermore, these expectations are not anchored by real variables, which means that the observable data does not give us sufficient information to model what happens in the causal pathways. So these issues are too complex for this basic course, but we hope to take them up in a later course which studies causal pathways in greater detail and depth.